I've seen things you wouldn't believe. A hand, broken, gesturing, pulled from the waters of Thessaloniki and carried by helicopter into the skies above.
Oh my god, that bit.
The frozen yet still bleeding body of a soldier uncovered from the snows 30 years later. The massif of a 35-foot statue of Lenin carried along the Danube. An entire town which jumps forward and backwards in years within the space of a single camera's pan. The naked, shivering body of Harvey Keitel stoops over, groin exposed, on the road to Sarajevo. But what I have not seen, only heard at a distance by great remove, as if carried on the wind, are echoes of that glittering ancient world I'm in Greece, and all of the islands and cliffs and sands that hold its remains. Because Theo Angelopoulos, the subject of today's podcast, is not, for the very most part, there are exceptions here and there are always exceptions, a filmmaker of the islands nor of the sands. He's a filmmaker whose Greece is that of snow and borders and itinerant travelling players, of mountains wreathed in fog and two-bit regional towns slick with slush and mud, its citizens bundled tightly in wooden hats and scarves. Woolen hats and scarves. Angelopoulos' cinema is a cinema of history's longue durée, the sweeping structure of epochal events that blur and bend into each other, in which private histories, small and fragile, struggle to be heard or to hold themselves in place. The history of a nation, and of the nation's porous borders and those who cross them, those that are spatial and those that are temporal. He would die in 2012 while shooting what would be his final film, struck down by a lorry that, it is not difficult to imagine, was crossing the same borders, stateless, caught in flows of capital history that he had spent his entire career capturing. A poet of alienation and nationhood, who saw himself, we will see exactly how, in a lineage not only of Homer, but of the Matakis brothers, the first filmmakers of the Balkans. He said, "Being simple is the hardest thing." He said, "I am trying to seek a new humanism, a new way." And to help me chart that way, like two lost children in the mist, is as ever Ralph Pritchard. Ralph, Kalispera.
Is that a Greek for something?
Scroof, good evening.
Hey, yes, well, it's quite late. It's getting quite late, just to set the scene.
It's Kali Nikto.
We're in my flat, as we often are. And it's 10:30 p.m. 10:36 p.m. We've just finished watching The Beekeeper, a mid-career masterwork by Theo Angelopoulos.
Yeah.
Liz Truss has just resigned. The Prime Minister has just resigned. Boris is coming back.
Talking of a queen that has departed its colony.
Yeah, exactly. We are discussing Theo Angelopoulos, a filmmaker who, we often say about great artists that their preoccupations are
repetitive.
Are small, are limited, and it's certainly true of Theo Angelopoulos. His films are about the same handful of things and not just about the same things, but manifest in the same literal mise en scène, like there are people meeting at borders and being unable to people. There's so I watched Voyage of Cythera, and The Suspended Step of the Stork, in the same evening, and the most powerful visual motif, inarguably, in The Voyage to Cythera, is a man on a kind of basically in the sea on a sort of like a very small 8 foot by 8 foot square,
like a kind of a boat,
floating jetty, but it's not. It's a floating jetty, exactly.
He loves those.
A floating jetty.
A floating jetty.
Getting in the mood for Boris season 2. A floating jetty. Theo Angelopoulos. It's an old man on a floating jetty because he is stateless, because he lived in the Soviet Union. He's coming back to Greece after 32 years to reunite with his family. There's also being away and coming back, family, alienation from family, A huge theme here in Angelopoulos' work. So this, and then at the very end of the film, spoiler alert, his wife, who he's been long estranged from, joins him on this jetty, and they are left together, and they float away. And the final shot of the film is extraordinary. That's Voyage to Cythera. The suspended step of the Stork, which is more explicitly about borders, and actually starts with another very startling scene of helicopters over some floating corpses of migrants.
Explicitly, this is 1995. As well. Years before
before Priti Patel,
contemporary migrant crisis, as it were. Boats in the boats in the Adriatic, boats in the Channel. This is years and years before.
Exactly. Mare Nostrum and all that. So this so hold in your head the floating jetty of Voyage to Cythera with the old man eventually reunited with his wife. Then fast forward a few years later, the suspended step of the Stork, which is 1991, I believe. There is a wedding taking place across a river, and the bride and the groom are on either side of the river, and their families are on either side of the river, and they marry. They marry without being able to touch each other. This is a
very literalized
intimacy, distance, pain, unavailability. All this yearning. I mean, this is this strong sense of yearning in Angelopoulos. And we watched The Beekeeper, which has, which in a way is a little bit of an anomaly in that it kind of
starring Marcello Mastroianni.
Seems more. It fits more into kind of just a general modernist European art house. It's his
tightest film, smallest cast.
Yeah.
Narratively, it's a short film for the Angelopoulos, under 2 hours. It also it focuses very much on the existential malaise of a single character without historical context, and something that we have in it. Actually, he does do historical context in that film. We can talk about that through the intrusions of pop music and
but not in the same, not with the same metaphorical.
He's not making a sweeping historical epic. He's not doing Bondarchuk, which is what he does in the rest of his films. But sorry, carry on.
Well, just because an earlier film, Travelling Players, we haven't seen all of his films, but we've sort of both of us watched. Kind of covered different eras and areas in his filmography, and he has a very big preoccupation with Greek history, which frankly makes a lot of his work inaccessible. It makes it quite
says you.
It says me.
I mean, any film that deals with its context is inherently inaccessible in a way, but he is particularly inaccessible because
I think there are ways in which.
But I think he's trying to confuse you in a way, because I think it's inaccessible for. So one of the things about Travelling Players is that until very late in Greece's history, the civil war in Greece. So we're talking about the period immediately after the Second World War. We're talking 1948, 9, a little bit before in a way, up until about the early 1950s. That wasn't called a civil war legally in Greece until many, many, many years later. So past the crisis of 74, I think even in the 80s or 90s, it was only then that they said this was a civil war. Until then, it had been called almost like a terrorist intervention. So but it split the population 50-50. So it's like saying to 50% of the population, you're terrorists for years and years and years. So
and a huge injustice.
A huge injustice.
Like
a great
the
deal
genocide being denied with the Armenians and stuff like that.
Sidebar. What genocide? No, we're not doing that on this podcast. Turkey girly. But there is I think he's trying to wrong foot you and confuse you with that as well, because I think we can talk about it, but one of his preoccupations in his more historical films, like The Hunters, like The Travelling Players, is to almost to kind of cast you adrift in the flow and a changing ebb and flow of historical forces, epochs, movements, allegiances, and to try and grip hold of intimate moments within those flows. So, Travelling Players focuses on a group of theatre performers from the Second World War up through into the crisis in the 50s, like the Civil War. So it kind of covers 15, 20 years. And we see how this band of kind of clowns, musicians and poets effectively kind of try and stick together and change. as they're pulled apart by the historical forces of their epoch. And so I think we're in a way supposed to be a little bit bamboozled. So I think you could try and track the I don't think these aren't historical films in the sense that we're supposed to understand the historical moments. But we're supposed to understand what it was probably like to be caught up in them, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply... I don't know anything about the history of Greece, so what you're telling me is kind of like simultaneously useful and also kind of confusing.
Yeah,
because like I don't... it's not that a film that's placed within a historical context should educate me or tell me about history. I don't mind about that. I think a film should tell me something about... A film set in a historical context should tell me something about the experience of that era that I can't understand through history books.
Do you think you get that from Travelling Players?
No, because I feel like Travelling Players demands of me a certain basic understanding of the history.
Of all his films, it is the most Wikipedia.
In the way that and yeah, there are like dates on screen and there are like protests on election days and all these things. In the way that like Andrei Rublev, I think is fantastic precisely because it gives you a sense of what it was to be around in that moment. And you don't need to know anything about
Kiev and Rus and all that.
Yeah, you don't need to know anything about...
Well, is he not like a bit like
period.
Miklos Jansko in a way? Like, look at the red and the white,
Yeah.
a film like that, you know, where you've got these changing fortunes and tides, and it's very... I mean, even then, you're looking at two political tendencies, which are Tsarists and Reds.
Yeah, I mean, the red and the white is almost like Alan Clark or something, in that it kind of reduces the political context down to the bare bones of cinematic tension.
And what happens there, that all transpires within the course of a couple of days.
Yeah.
Whereas here, you know, so a film like Travelling Players takes... And often, like I said in the intro, often within a scene will change epoch. You know, you'll suddenly get a character in historic garb walking amongst people who are in slightly less historic garb. You'll get a street and the camera will pan and suddenly there'll be a procession moving up the street and it will take you a little while to realize those people are actually marching 10 years, 15 years earlier because of you suddenly notice their costumes and you're like, fuck, okay, we've traveled back in time. So he's a great one for... in his historical films, in those films, jumping around between epochs, they are harder to follow. But maybe we should start then with his more intimate films, his films of borders, so his Border trilogy, and also his kind of...
What is the Border trilogy? Is it
Border trilogy,
Landscape
and the Mist, Eternity in a Day, which doesn't feel like it should be one, and we might need to pull up. So yeah. Angelopoulos, his films throughout his career fit into these broadly conceived
Hold up,
trilogies.
I'm afraid to correct you here.
Trilogy of Borders.
The Trilogy of Borders is The Suspended Step of the Stork,
Yeah.
Ulysses Gaze, and Eternity in a Day.
Eternity in a Day, that's it, yeah.
So I'm like literally halfway through this trilogy because I gave up after an hour of Ulysses
Okay, so
Gaze
we've got that.
It was
So
not that good.
Describe to me the other trilogies.
So the other trilogy, so we have... So in 1970 he makes Reconstitution.
First film.
Black and white. Don't know anything about it. He also made like a weird like a short about a reality show. I need to investigate this.
He also made a documentary about
listeners
Athens.
can maybe tell us if this is any good. It's on Karen Gaga. Then he makes Days of 36, The Travelling Players, and The Hunters, all of which comprise the Trilogy of History. So this makes sense. They're very historical films. You say that you did not find The Hunters very engaging. Days of 36,
I will. We can quickly. We'll talk about later about certain tropes and recurring motifs in Angelopoulos. The Hunters embodies those to a parodic extent, and it's a very, very weak film, despite having a superlative opening 10.
I feel like Travelling Players... I haven't seen Days of 36, but Travelling Players does feel like it does, at the very least, set out Angelopoulos' style.
He sets out his stall.
Like sort of formally, you're like, okay, this is clearly a distinctive voice. No one else makes films like this. It's very exciting. So then he makes Anna the Grey, which is just a standalone. Then the Trilogy of Silence, Voyage to Cythera, which is about this makes total sense. This trilogy, Voyage to Cythera, about a man who comes back from Russia after 32 years. He reunites with his family in Greece.
Nostalgia.
Exactly, yeah. And he doesn't say very much. So Trilogy of Silence is very good. Beekeeper, which we just watched, Marcelo Mastroianni, doesn't say very much. So it's again about these men, these estranged men who return or leave and depart, and you don't quite know what they're feeling. It's a bit like that film Sundown that we reviewed at the Polish Festival. Then Trilogy of Silence, Landscapes in the Mist, which is probably Angelopoulos' most famous film or most watched film.
Probably his best known, and I think most feted at awards.
And that is about these two brother and sister, very small children who they have this idea of traveling to Germany to find their father. They think they'll be able to find their father.
Well, they're lied to in a way.
Yeah,
they're told that their father is working in Germany, although their father clearly doesn't exist. They kind of run away from their mother. She clearly fucked around and didn't know who the father was. And they go in this kind of, and this is a trope of Angelopoulos, which is the kind of fictive, imaginary, you could almost say Homeric Odyssey. People go. So what Angelopoulos does is he inverts in so many of his films the mythology of Greece that we know. You know, so taking
the Iliad and the
Odyssey. So war is a big preoccupation. There's your Iliad, and Odyssey is the journey, and the journey is a major structural motif in all of his films. Very few of his films, I can't think any. The Hunters actually takes place in one location, but most of his films range back and forth between quite similar locations, but Ulysses' Gaze is the most geographically far-reached because it goes from Greece through Albania, Sarajevo, goes up into Bosnia, Serbia and Bosnia.
We could have a map with like lines on it, of where each film travels.
There could be a map. It could exist on Angelopoulos
Angelopoulos
wiki.
Quite travelly. They all Voyage to Cythera stays in the same place.
Okay, so there are always exceptions, as I was saying, but most of his films revolve around journeys. Often those journeys,
which is ironic because it's called Voyage.
Voyage.
I think
there we go.
I think he just stays there. Well, I might be.
But I mean, for him, it's like internal voyages and external voyages happen simultaneously, and I think you get these inverted Homeric quests, effectively, which often are pointless in the sense of, or they are fated to fail. Like the two children who are in search of their father in Germany, obviously that adventure will come to nothing because there is no father in Germany. It's a failed quest. The Beekeeper, this kind of sad sack, Marcello Mastroianni, is he's actually returning back to his father's house, which you realise, but it's kind of described as him working as a beekeeper in various places in Greece.
He's very lost and unavailable.
Very lost and unavailable. And this is it. There are these kind of rootless journeys, which take place, and again, like I said in the intro, they almost always take place in non-signifying parts of Greece. So it's not the Greece you will know from Piavolis Nostos. It's not the Greece of islands and beautiful cliffs, and it's not. There's one thing we talked about comparisons with Antonioni. Antonioni told Italy through beautiful islands and modern cities. Angelopoulos tells it through provincial towns. He's a filmmaker of Sheffield and Middlesbrough, and he's not taking us to London. And
that being said, I mean, I think Red Desert shows off the sort of industrial
Oh, for sure. There are elements of that.
And I think there's something that he does with La Notte, which is quite kind of, even though it's sort of new and flashy and modern, there's a kind of
soullessness.
That's what's so amazing about Antonio and why we always come back to him. It's because there's he's able to have a feeling, a cinematic feeling that runs through all these films that otherwise have quite different sort of content.
And also a trilogy.
Yeah.
But I think, to talk about these kind of more intimate films in this phase in the 80s, he looks at kind of, I mean, you could chart it against his own development of his own life and his own psychology or whatever, but he goes for these films about middle-aged men, often going through periods of existential malaise, often very silent, unable to express or articulate their needs or wants or vision for their lives, and I think, go on.
I just wanted to complete the filmography because there are 4 different trilogies: History, Silence, Borders, Greece. So the Trilogy of Borders, I haven't seen Eternity in a Day, but Suspended Step of the Stork literally has the scene of a wedding happening across the border, and there's several scenes where a man kind of raises his step. I guess that's a suspended
The
step.
army officer puts his foot above the border.
Above
He says,
the
"If I
border.
step 1 foot further, I'll be killed."
Exactly, and he does this once at the beginning and once at the end. And the border is just kind of like, it's not a sort of discourse point about, like a way to sort of somehow like make you aware of borders, or as like a
Yeah, he's not saying,
like a fascistic
isn't
dynamic or
being a
something.
migrant terrible in a specific way.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
saying, isn't being lost and adrift.
He's sort
terrible?
of saying that the border is like a kind of condition of life.
Yes, yeah.
And like that we'll never escape the border. Like you could abolish this border like this. Like you could like there's this amazing bit where, I mean, you've only seen half of it, but there's an amazing bit where the main character gets off with this woman. Like, and you don't really, you see the sex, and we're going to talk about how he depicts sex soon, but that's a whole other conversation. But he seduces this woman very easily, very simply, very Angelopoulosly, at this at the party. You know, she just follows him, and then he kind of beckons her, and then they have sex. They're naked in the room, and then afterwards he says, "Oh, you said another's name," you know. And she doesn't really sort of comment on this very much, but it's sort of like they acknowledge it. And then that's it. And then he encounters her later on in the film. He's a journalist trying to find helping Jean Moreau's character meet her husband, disappeared husband, who's a politician played by Mastroianni, who might be this man who's hovering about in the village. They're both characters played by Mastroianni. And it's really ambiguous. Like, so much of it is ambiguous. But what isn't ambiguous is that this guy shags this beautiful young Greek woman in the village, and she's sort of cried out the name of another during sex, and then later on in the film he discovers that she's the one getting married to this man, but obviously she hasn't seen the man for however long because he's on the other side of the border, and there are these armed guards all night, and it starts with him like sending a radio, a noisy radio across the river.
Oh, it's that guy.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Anyway.
So
borders, and
borders
then
are
there's a trilogy of,
and borders are literalized, and borders are metaphorical. They're internal. They are temporal. They are physical. They are spatial. So for him, the border is everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fully it's a real.
It's biopolitics.
Yeah, it's like it's not political, but it's like beyond political. It's like personal, psychological. It's spiritual, really. A lot of Angelopoulos' films do feel religious in a way, which is strange because they don't make unlike Tarkovsky, they don't like.
We very see churches.
They don't invoke.
We see
actually
what we do see a lot
Bible,
of is we see a lot of civic and communal ritual. So weddings, New Year's Eve parties are a big thing for him. So in many of his films, there are quite memorable New Year's Eve parties. People meeting and communing at a bar. Friends reuniting.com. So there, but we do not see much of the church, and we do not see much of the priests.
Yeah.
Which
it's about
is
the people. It's about the polis. It's about and there are a lot of scenes where crowds move around and follow rituals, and I think this is very interesting because as an outsider to Greek culture, these rituals feel sort of like completely spontaneous and like a kind of a strange coincidence, or like almost like watching like geese sort of like fly together or something. You know,
in a V.
I don't know. I'm not reducing Greeks to the state of geese, but I'm just saying.
That's what you're saying.
I'm just saying there's a sort
but
of,
there
like
are
maybe that
amazing
maybe there is. But I think what I mean to say is that like beyond the traveling players, like when he enters the Trilogy of Silence and Borders, like he learns how to depict these things without there being a contingent on.
He learns how to depict these things without being alienating, and because one of the early strains of his film is a use of a kind of track and pan on his camera. So his camera is hoisted onto a crane. Traveling players, it kind of moves through a house. It will follow a crowd. It will follow a scene, often in mid or far distance. as he kind of evolves and gets into the Trilogy of Silence, we begin to get close-ups, which is unusual for Angelopoulos. There are very few close-ups in his films, so when he does them, it's a momentous moment. We obviously just watched The Beekeeper.
Like a small handful of extraordinary close-ups that
really
demonstrate
the girl that he is traveling with, biting his hand and drawing blood from his hand, and the camera zooms in there. We've got the scene where they have very passionate, almost violent, I would say, sex on the stage of a cinema, for places in an abandoned cinema, and the camera is very close on their bodies there in a way that Head and Shoulders shot, basically, which is you don't again see in his earlier films, because he's, I think, learning to focus on these more existential narratives that are caught up in this wider historical flow. And what, like I said in the beginning, you don't see it, very rarely see. He shot a winter, snow. I mean, one of the overburdening images of an Angelopoulos film, the signifiers of it are snow and fog, and rain to a lesser extent. And then in The Beekeeper, there are scenes of Mastroianni tending to his bees in spring. In Eternity in a Day, which stars Bruno Ganz, it's very Proustian in a way. He spends it's about a kind of disaffected, largely silent, middle-aged man. I say late middle-aged man, divorced again, kind of wandering around this kind of quite desultory, unpleasant-looking port town, and then the film flashes back. He's dying. The film flashes back to memories by the sea, and those bits are shot in summer, and they kind of look like Piavoli, like Nostos, The Return or something. And so they shoot back to the beach, and they're very golden and beautiful.
I need to see Nostos. I love that Voices in Time film.
Nostos is incredible.
And The Blue Planet, but I've never seen
Absolutely
Nostos.
Absurd fucking film.
Is it like top 10 material?
Yeah, pretty much.
Like close.
It's getting there, yeah.
Top 50.
But that film, he shows summer, he depicts summer, depicts this kind of lapsarian, beautiful past, basically. And he does tend towards nostalgia. The Beekeeper, the evaporated family life that this guy's never had, Eternity in a Day, the evaporated past. His wife is dead in the film, so he has flashbacks to his wife. And again, talking about borders, one of the borders, Bruno Ganz plays a writer who spent his entire life writing books, and one of the complaints in the flashbacks is his wife, who's an absolute top 10 MILF. Keeps saying
to Penny Morden.
Yeah, keeps saying to him, I'm trying to catch you between two books, and they're at a family event on the sea, and he keeps running away and to go and work on his book. And he realizes once she's dead that he spent his entire life creating this barrier between, he never quite, he loved his wife when she was dead, and then regrets and is filled with eternal longing for her. So there are borders that are emotional, that are political, which is exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about as you began to talk about the style, the Theo Angelopoulos style, and also think about the relationship to Tarkovsky, because I feel like my initial response was, okay, this guy does a thing Tarkovsky does, but he does it like harder and more like
unpack that
more limitedly. But then I was like, when I think about nostalgia, like the shots in nostalgia are so sparingly, like they're so programmatic in a way. They're so like, it's nostalgia by Tarkovsky. They're so like the candle shot, like tracking when the guy lights the candle and walks across, or just these like the tracking shots are so planned out,
Oneric.
Exactly. Whereas they are more dreamlike. But the pan sequences, or whatever they're called, like in Angelopoulos, are like, they're more floaty, they're more commonplace in a way. It's so common for a shot to just rise up, and this perspective shift you get when you rise up and you see
often
the landscape
unnecessarily. It doesn't need to be a shot done on a crane, but he does it.
Theo, you just chill out. You don't need to keep. Hold on, our wines will get confused.
Oh, they will.
Could you pull that wine back?
Let's not cross our wine.
Yeah, we've been drinking a lot of wine. I don't know if this is evident to listeners. I'm so glad to be podding about Angelopoulos. I knew this was a moment that had to happen, because like it's been a while in the making. Like really watching enough of his films to kind of get. Anyway,
Well, no, but we should talk about it because we have spent the last 2 weeks probably just solely watching Angelopoulos. That's all I watched.
Martin Scorsese. It's like a little bit lame that I'm like quoting Martin Scorsese. Then again, Martin Scorsese, he's made some alright films.
Yes.
He's championed some very good films.
That's more important. Yeah, the World Cinema Foundation.
And he says that Theo Angelopoulos is a masterful filmmaker. He really understands how to control the frame. There are sequences in his work. The wedding scene in The Suspended Step of the Stork, which I've mentioned a few times already. The rape scene in Landscapes in the Mist, which I haven't mentioned, but that is pretty powerful and shocking. Or any given scene in The Travelling Players. Don't know, it's a bit,
I mean, Travelling Players is a purely pyrotechnic film. It's incredible what he does with crowds and masses of people.
It's true.
Particularly for Scorsese as a historical filmmaker.
Yeah.
Particularly interesting.
Where the slightest movement, the slightest change in distance sends reverberations through the film and through the viewer. The total effect is hypnotic, sweeping, and profoundly emotional. His sense of control is almost otherworldly. I mean, this quote speaks to me hugely. I would say, like if you're making films and you're not doing this, attempting to do what Scorsese says, sending reverberations through the film and through the viewer, through the slightest changes in distance, the slightest movement, a total effect that is hypnotic, sweeping, and profoundly emotional. You watch it and it is, the more you concentrate on it, the more you get out of it. It is like, it's beautiful. And he seems, I mean, it's also like very samey. It's like simultaneously very spiritual, very well paced. Landscapes in the Mist is perhaps the best example of this particular kind of pacing because it's such a road movie and it has Beekeeper as well to an extent.
It's also a road film.
They're road films and they just go from place to place and you just spend a while in a place. You deal with whatever the drama of the day is, and usually the drama is just the person still wants the thing they want. Like narratively, I always make this point about art house films. Like all the best art house films conform to all the conform to the most important conventional rules of like script writing. All that lame shit you read about script, how to write like a conventional script, and everyone ends up writing like a bad version of Chinatown or whatever. But like actually, and so people are like, oh, we don't need rules, whatever. But actually, like you do need rules. But like Bresson, Tarkovsky, Angelopoulos, like they all actually follow the 3-act structure. They all actually follow like every character having a motive, like all the stuff that you need in a film.
Well, it's often spelled out very blatantly. So, Beekeeper, because it's freshest in my mind, as a divorced husband, at the beginning we see him act very strained at his daughter's wedding. And he actually picks her up like a child and sings to her. And he sings this song about a pepper tree. And he then strikes up this uncanny Bonnie and Clyde style, or actually probably Paper Moon, this Bogdanovich style relationship with this kind of castaway girl, this drifter. And they have this kind of quite erotically charged will they, won't they, narrative, which is again, trope. They separate, conjoin. They during this whole time, this girl is obviously a kind of almost like a stand-in for his wife, for his daughters. He has strained relationships with, and then he's gradually making his way back to his father's house. And he comes back to his father's house, and there he consummates the relationship with this girl, and then she departs. So there is actually quite a very, very, very structured narrative with all that drifting, all these kind of loose, amorphous borders. It's a very similar film, I was saying earlier, to Eternity in a Day, which also features a diaphanous, sorry for that word, drifting man who's unsure what he wants, but you kind of know what he wants, which is connection. He actually connects with a young Albanian boy who's a refugee, and at first agrees to drive him back to Albania. There's one of those truly only Angelopoulos could moments where they drive through the snow to the Albanian border, and they get there, and there's this one thing Angelopoulos is very good is at doing these big landscape scenes with figures in them who are often frozen like mannequins. He does
that is so haunting when he does that.
So haunting. But I would say in Eternity in a Day, it's its most powerful. He gets there and they walk towards this border and slowly out of the fog. you see this fence, but you don't actually see the outline of the fence. All you see are people climbing it, but they're kind of like frogs on a glass window almost. All these people, and there's just probably 100 people stretched out as the camera pans. You know, just kind of still, and there's border guards who are on these towers and they're unmoving, and you see them have this moment, and then they run away from this border. So that, you know, again, it literalizes the border, but it's also a space really charged with this metaphorical exit. It's like crossing over into the realm of death. It is such a powerful scene. No one else does it like him. It's incredible.
Yeah, that he does have these amazing
set pieces,
ending set pieces, especially at the end. So set pieces. I mean, Beekeeper ends with the bee things. Spoiler alert! There's lots of spoilers in the next minute of me talking about endings. Yeah. The Beekeeper ends with him turning over the boxes of bees and kind of like collapsing amongst a kind of flurry of bees. Suspended Step of the Stork has these men climbing telephone poles in this beautiful way. I mean, it's just a classic thing in cinema. Like, like the greatest cinematic technique is just to watch someone doing something that's a little bit unusual, like a physical activity that's a little unusual and sort of catches your eye and is kind of hypnotic. And there are these phone lines in Greece, probably in lots of places, that that have like little thin sticks of metal coming out of the phone line so that the man can climb up it.
That's like all old school phone lines.
Yeah. And the man has shoes that can clamp onto these. So he's like climbing up, and he's safe climbing up these things because it's all clamping on. He's got his clamp-ons. And you just watch, like, the shot widens out. Initially, it's just a man walking along. It's Mastroianni, or I think it's Mastroianni walking out. No, it's the main character walking along the path.
The journalist.
And then it widens out, and you see these telephone boxes, and then all these men are simultaneously in sync climbing up these telephone poles.
That's what it is. So it's strange to watch one person doing a thing, but Angelopoulos' approach is, what if 10 people were doing this?
Yeah,
what if 20 people?
Yeah.
So
he's a choreographer.
He's literally a choreographer. In Eternity in a Day, interestingly, there's a scene where the young boy and Bruno Gans who's identified only as A. No, he's not. He's Alexandros, sorry, in this one. They are in a bus at night, driving toward a ferry where they may separate their ways. And they look out the window, and there's 3 men in yellow raincoats cycling in unison in the darkness. And it's incredibly transcendent in a way. You know, it's an unexpected moment of kind of alignment and beauty in a world of chaos and confusion. But that's it. It's the people suspended on this fence on the Albanian border. Another 2 amazing scenes I will mention if we're doing just kind of shopping list of scenes in Landscape in the Mist. I must remember to talk about Thanatos. I must remember to talk about death. But there is a moment where, like I said in the beginning, a hand of a sculpture is pulled out of the water by a helicopter. And so you don't see the helicopter for much of this scene. You just see this hand kind of hanging, pointing its kind of broken finger in a kind of accusatory way, but also in a kind of direction way, like it's pointing towards a destination. And it's just suspended there. It's an insane, uncontextualized moment. Like, you know, you don't even need to begin asking questions of that, because it's like, why, how was this recovered? Why? Why is it there? Why is it being pulled away? And the camera kind of pulls back, and you see this helicopter kind of fly this hand off into the distance. And meanwhile, the characters, the 2 kids, and the man who again, an uncommon meeting, the man who shacked up with them and is helping this young biker who's helping them drive around, kind of caring for them. They just sit there and watch it. And then in Ulysses Gaze, which is a Harvey Keitel film, he travels up the Danube on a ship which is carrying a Lenin statue. And again, Lenin's hand is positioned in such a way on this barge that it's kind of pointing a direction. So it's not that Angelopoulos is uninterested in the Greek past in which we think statues, but he just again inverts them, like the way he inverts the Homeric Odyssey. He actually inverts statues as well. You know, statues become kind of pathetic. They become imbued with great humour. It's very funny watching this Lenin statue kind of float down the Danube. You know, he's sitting on it and he's reading lines from Homer. I think he reads the lines from Homer. No, it's later in the film where he reads the lines where he's like, you know, I will come again, but you will not recognise me, which is also a biblical reference as well.
Can I just say about because this is a topic that came up recently, and I when we were chatting, not on a podcast, but on an app called WhatsApp. We were discussing. We were initially discussing Herzog, and to give background, this is very interesting. For me, fascinating discussion. Werner Herzog's latter work is kind of ugly.
Yeah.
And people don't really talk about this. And also Herzog famously doesn't really watch films.
He hates film.
Which I think is kind of, I don't get that far. But he doesn't, he's like, I have watched 7 films. That's what he says. He's like, he has this weird book of advice by Herzog. And he says read many books.
Read.
And then he's watched 7 films or something.
He famously says he's too busy to watch films.
Yeah, but it's you make films. What's wrong with you? I mean, obviously he's made some fantastic films, but we were talking about this because he made these weird documentaries about the internet and stuff. And he towards the end of his career, I mean, he's still alive, but there's a preoccupation with the extraordinary things of nature, and I'm very much
or fit people who are going against the odds.
Yeah. And so you realise that his preoccupation is actually more in terms of form and content. I mean, obviously, I find the subject of Herzog's films fascinating, but I mean, Grizzly Man, for instance, is a bit ugly. It's not a beautiful, extraordinary film in the way that Aguirre Wrath of God is, and yet they're both deeply compelling characters. But I would never watch Grizzly Man again. I've got the idea. I've seen it once.
Yeah.
Whereas Aguirre Wrath of God is
Aguirre is at least formally, it's his most formal film.
It's deeply transcendently beautiful.
Yeah.
Because of the camera work and because of the editing. And then I realized that there's this woman, Beata, I can't remember her name. Bloody hell. Let's find it.
Some woman.
I don't want to make this important point and then not remember, not have the person's
You
name.
can erase her name. Or you just invent it.
How do you spell Beata?
While Ralph is using the internet, I think one thing I want to talk about while Ralph is chasing, so I'm going to take a slight diversion here, is that one of the, I think it came to me while watching 8 or 9 of these Angelopoulos films over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, is that one of his preoccupations is a slight conceitedness about the role and vision of the artist.
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of his films, the protagonist is a foil for Angelopoulos himself. So in Ulysses Gaze, the main character played by Harvey Keitel is called A. In Eternity and Day, the character is Alexandros. In The Beekeeper as well, the character's first name begins with A. So there's a lot of these kind of autobiographical insertions into his films. And I think Ulysses Gaze is the most blatant of these because the film fundamentally is about Harvey Keitel traveling to, he's an emigre, again a trope for Angelopoulos, a kind of exile who returns to Greece, nominally to screen some of his films, but then goes on this kind of quest whose end he does not know. He's in search basically of these 3 undeveloped reels by the Matsakis brothers, who are the first filmmakers in the Balkans, whose identity is disputed, whether they are Albanian.
They filmed some Weavers, right?
Weavers, yeah, they were very much like
they keep
Lumiere.
playing the shot.
They were more artistic than the Lumieres, but because the Lumieres were not interested in film, they actually decried film as a viable entity. But the Matsakis brothers from 1905 onwards were making films in the Balkans. They're the first filmmakers in the Balkans. He's trying to basically find the seed of Greek filmmaking, which is these 3 undeveloped reels, which are supposedly the first reels ever shot by the Matsakis brothers. And it's obviously kind of a pointless, futile enterprise. It's an enterprise that takes him towards death. He travels through these increasingly bleak, snowbound landscapes. He goes to Sarajevo. People die around him. He travels into a literal war zone. And that's the thing, the kind of inverted, pointless quest. It's not Odysseus going home. it's the inverse. It's people kind of going into nothingness and going into war or going into chaos. And I think the Ulysses Gaze is the most blatant of them because it's very much Angelopoulos reflecting on the filmmaker as Odysseus, the filmmaker as I am the inheritor of the Matsakis brothers. And it's very much like
do a lot of stuff about legacy.
The legacy, the burden of viewing, you know, because Keitel kind of talks in one of his monologues. He's very much like, you know, I'm in search of the gaze. You know, again, so I think it kind of literalizes a lot of this stuff that's better not said. But he's very much, I think, infused. Angelopoulos is aware of what he's doing as the burden of history.
Can I?
I filled that void quite well.
But no, you did. It was a good point. It connects very much to the earlier stuff about traveling players and this sort of Odyssean turn. I'm a bit lost. I'm just so unfamiliar with Greek history that
you went a private education.
Yeah, but I didn't pick classics. I wish I had picked classics.
I thought it was
my advice to people entering private school is do the things you can't do elsewhere. I didn't choose. Actually, I did do Latin.
Get a column in a newspaper.
But yes. So Strotzek by Werner Herzog has is a cinematography by Thomas Mauch, who also did A Geralt of God and The Power of Emotions, and edited by Beate Meinke Yellinghaus. Beate Meinke Yellinghaus is an extraordinary editor who did loads of the Kluger films, loads of the Herzog films.
The new German cinema, she was like the mover shaker.
And you know, actually, when you look through her IMDb and you look at these credits, you're like, okay, these films that have different directors do actually have something in common editing-wise. And that's actually and actually, when you think about the directors, Kluger, I think, was more Godardian. He was more integrated in terms of form, but you know, Herzog and also Fassbinder, if you look at the crew he works with, you know, very distinctive visions across those crew, perhaps more than with Fassbinder. Fassbinder wasn't so preoccupied with form. He was, I mean, the content for him was burning. It was very much, you know, his life and his work was aligned. But all of this is to say, this is not some just random point. Tonino Guerra. I think all good cinephiles of European cinema will be aware of this individual. He co-wrote L'Avventura La Notte. If you're wondering why The Beekeeper feels a bit like the early Antonioni films, and it's not just because Mastroianni appears in them. She appears in La Notte, which I saw rewatched recently. It's also because Tony Negro co-wrote, and he always co-wrote with the director, pretty much. But yes, he was a fantastically prolific co-writer of films by extraordinary directors. He co-wrote Nostalgia with Andrei Tarkovsky.
This makes sense because these films all share a vibe.
They all massively share a vibe. So I don't want to detract from auteur theory, which I love and which buttresses my own ambitions as a filmmaker. But, you know, Guerra really did something for all of these films. I mean, he did Landscapes and the Mist. He did...
but it doesn't take... There's across all of Angelopoulos' filmmaking, there are consistent, repetitive tropes and themes that we've referred to that are him. They bear his...
I'm not saying they're all Tonino Guerra's, but I'm just saying that, like, this continuity... There's another continuity going on there, and it very much applies to Nostalgia by Tarkovsky, which is no coincidence that we've mentioned that several times.
Particularly in those films of silence in the 80s, you know, you've got the stamp of the existential malaise of Antonioni and the kind of spiritual,
it's in the water,
transcendence of Tarkovsky. It's very much kind of like in the way Angelopoulos kind of as a tuning fork for those various tendencies in European art house filmmaking, as you might say. But I think one of the amazing things about him is, even for the weaker films like The Hunters and Traveling Players, whatever, is his ability to infuse them with these enormous, and to very much literalize very enormous historical machineries clunking into place. Like Traveling Players is a long fucking film. It's like 4 hours long. But it's an extraordinary...
I have only watched the first hour and a half.
It's an extraordinary approach to, I mentioned in the intro, like longue durée. I'm talking about the Annales French...
Talking about Anne Summers.
Anne Summers. I'm talking about talking about the Annales School of French
Long
History.
durée.
No, I don't do long durée, mate. But the idea behind the Annales School was that, and Fernand Braudel was one of the early proponents of this, was the idea that you could look at the history of a valley or a region, and you could look at it over 100 years at all these different scales, like the ecological, the sociological, the religious. You could look at burials and deaths and marriages, and you could understand. You'd get as good an understanding, if not better understanding, of the history of the country or of the time from that than you would from looking at the great man theory of history, like kings and princes and so on. So there's a very much Annales vibe running through Angelopoulos' filmmaking, which is to take a slice of an epoch, but you do get intimate stories within them. Traveling Players focuses on a group of traveling musicians. Landscape in the Mist is a film about its era. It's about a film about modern Greece after 1974. Kind of normalized capitalist Greece after 1974. And, again, these kids who are going on this kind of fantastical journey, as it were, to find their dad, bump up against, a gay biker, sort of like itinerant migrant laborers, and they kind of hang out in these transitional non-spaces all the time, which is, and that's
and a nonce space,
literally. Because we could talk about the rape, because there is an extraordinary scene where they are picked up by this driver who agrees to drive them north, and there's an incredible, very moving, very sinister rape scene, which I think is incredibly well done. Do you want to talk about that? Because I think that's one of the moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's dicey, but I'm going to use it as a way to transition into what I was going to, my last point about Angelopoulos, which is how he depicts intimacy.
Yeah.
In a way, I wouldn't describe this scene as an intimate scene because, A, because it's like incredibly violent, and B, because you don't really see the moment. The little girl is dragged into the back of this truck. There's this kind of this brief chase, and then a kind of
static camera,
and a static camera, and then a kind of acceptance of what, and like it's just done. A certain amount is left to the viewer's imagination, but it's just very chilling. And I think partly chilling because it comes out of nowhere. There's no music. There's no dun 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 dun, It just sort of like, it happens, and you're sort of like snapped out of your meditative fugue, and then like confronted with like a horrendous like abuse, and this all happens within, like, as Scorsese beautifully articulated it, like camera movements which send shockwaves through the viewer. Like,
and one of the amazing things that it's this kind of almost, I don't want to do structural film. I'm not going to say it. This is structural film, but there's almost like a Michael Snow-esque vibe to that scene, because what happens is it's shot in a kind of very wide angle lens, and to the left of the scene we see the back of the truck where we know this rape is happening, and we see a car pull up into a lay-by, another car, these two black cars. And obviously, narrative Hollywood head says, right, well, someone's going to get out of this car and realise that something's amiss and rescue this girl. But all that happens is the people just chat for a second, get back into their cars and drive off. And it's this amazing awareness of the indifference of the flows of history. Like, you might be suffering immense horrors, and the people in the next room have no awareness. Or
this is very true.
It's like a great nod to his understanding of history in a way.
Yeah, because there isn't like a savior. There isn't like... No. I mean, it's very interesting. We talked about, in Beekeeper, you mentioned like this girl gets robbed while Mastroianni is walking past this girl. Yeah. And there seems to be no possible connection between them. And you immediately said, oh, this is a Chekhov's gun. And it's like, again, he uses these classic cinematic screenwriting devices, but in the service of like a real vibe, rather than like some kind of complex narrative. Because he doesn't save her from being... No, he doesn't. But then, like, it's like, obviously we're being shown this for a reason. It's not just like
Yeah.
It's not like a sort of even like a Lenotte-ish. Oh God, look at the degeneration of life.
Yeah.
Like this woman is important to him. Like he's noticed her, we've noticed her, we've noticed this. Like it's all important. And with that that indifference, it's all the cars pulling up. I mean, as you say, structural film. Structural film. Angelopoulos allows us to understand that structural film is like the savior of like film from simply being about content and experience.
Yeah.
Because it roots cinema in what cinema is like best at, which is
time and space.
Yeah, and also like tension and like holding back. And tension, I don't necessarily just mean like film noir tension or whatever, but I mean like withholding certain information such that like visual information, just like a shot moving across a space. This is why like when we did the Michael Snow episode, like I was raving specifically about, not so much about the La Région Centrale, but about Wavelength.
Yeah,
because
one of the
it's
greatest
like,
films ever made.
Because it's a shot, it's like it is a structure, a very obviously a structural film that like it's just one shot that goes in and very close, but it also has like an off-screen, on-screen.
It
tension.
discards a narrative,
Yeah,
but
it has
the
a
narrative
there.
kind of informs the structure. It bolsters the structural film.
Yeah, and
the implication of a narrative does.
And in that sense, and we're talking to Daniel and Igor, and I think Daniel at least was sort of like preferring other Snow films because they were more purely structural. But I think like the key to structural film is that it holds the key to what is engaging about film in general.
Yeah.
While not necessarily being always the most engaging film on a more like to most people. But like, you can't look at moving image right now in London, like very often it forgets this thing that structural cinema understands, which is like the need to kind of withhold and show very judiciously.
I think it's interesting we talked about indifference, because indifference plays a big part. We talked about these mannequin-like bodies that stand in landscapes. Often a lot of times things happen in an Angelopoulos film that you think might elicit a stronger reaction. But they don't, because I think people have been inured to tragedy in his films. Like, often things that are quite violent, like deaths or murders, happen, and people don't really remark on them. A very great thing that happens in Travelling Players are executions. Executions form a big part of that, and often people are murdered and no one really remarks on it. And in The Beekeeper, one point Marcello Mastroianni drives through the wall of a restaurant,
so
but no one reacts really to it. Only the girl does.
Yeah.
She runs out of the cafe and runs into his car, but no one really does anything. They just kind of stand there as if this is the most.
It's just a way
ordinary
for him
thing.
to get her attention. I love that.
But it's a beautiful rom-com moment. But I think one of the great things about Angelopoulos,
Beekeeper, my favorite rom-com. That's my
It
new. That's
literally
my new
is.
like
That's a
way
new
to
take.
alienate myself from people in the film industry. So yeah, rom-com.
It is a
The
rom-com.
Beekeeper by Theo Angelopoulos.
Yeah,
I haven't seen that one. What's it? Is it called Jennifer Aniston? No,
10
it's not. It's
thousand
not.
things I hate about you. But it's amazing because he really deals with indifference really well, and there's he has a lot of sullen, silent characters who don't voice themselves. Ulysses Gay's one of the great things that happens in the first third of the film, and quarter of the film, is Harvey Keitel driving over the Albanian border with this taxi driver, and they share this really intimate moment because they get kind of snowed in, and the driver bears his soul on this mountainside, and Harvey Keitel doesn't really say anything in this scene. He's kind of unmoved by this other man's story because he's on his own journey. He's on his own indeterminate journey. It's incredible thinking about this really charismatic taxi driver who tells this really beautiful story and really wants to kind of empathise with Harvey Keitel. And Harvey Keitel doesn't really do anything. He doesn't really say anything. He's just locked into his own tragedy. And that's one of these beautiful moments where you see opportunities for people to be saved in his films, and they are not saved. He doesn't save them. And that's his humanism. It's kind of like, it's a call to arms in a way, I think, for people to care more.
Yeah, without being told, like,
Yeah.
you should care more in like a didactic way.
Yeah.
it just sort of opens things out a bit.
Because he doesn't resolve.
And gives us a moment to sort of like just
He's so
experience
good, but like
time.
fucking strap yourselves in with him, because it's like, I don't recommend watching one Angelopoulos film. I recommend watching 2
binge.
or 3.
You have to binge. You have to commit to the bit, and
Yeah.
many people in the society are too busy. Cost of living
These
and all that,
days.
they can't handle
They're caught up in
watching
the ebb and flow of
fucking 5
historical
hours
moment,
of
bro.
like Greek shots, Greek shots of Greek.
But maybe
landscape.
watch 20 in a day, because it is
And The Beekeeper, I think, because The Beekeeper was only
watch
2
those
hours.
two.
And also, but I just want a final point: intimate shots, sex scenes, no intimacy
Do it.
coordinators, none of that bullshit. But like wide angle, amazing wide angle, and then occasional very judicious close-ups. There's something amazing about the way he shoots intimacy. It's very ritualized. It's very. I mean, there's the great principle of cinema basically is that you don't show things as they are. You show things how they feel. You know, and he does this with sex. He doesn't. He very rarely shows. He shows almost every film he has some sort of sex scene. He very rarely shows sex as it would be if you.
The
just
only
like started
exception to the
filming
rule,
some
I think,
sex.
could be Traveling Players, where he was a younger neophyte filmmaker, and you see 2 of the traveling players, as it were, have sex. And you see them through a window, and someone wants to get into the bedroom and they can't, and it's very much like a man rotting on top of a woman. But that's a very
There's a bit
rare.
of that, but like the way they're
how he
filmed,
treats and handles intimacy.
there's a lot of stuff in wide angle, and there's a lot of stuff where, because I think the obvious thing is to shoot a sex scene in close up, and he sort of resists this urge. And I mean, in the one scene that I can think of where he shoots a sex scene in close up, it was in The Beekeeper, and the girl he's with is, the whole thing is she's actually not thinking about the guy she's fucking. She's looking at Mastroianni's character, and and there's this amazing bit where he looks at. It's shot reverse shot. You see him, and then you see her, and she's looking at him, and then her gaze kind of turns around, but you can't hear him move exactly. But then there's this slit of light that opens up, and then you realize he's leaving because he can't bear to sort of like be in
the same room.
As these young people fucking. But she's like turning around and watching him while he's walking out, and clearly thinking about him more than she's thinking about the person she's fucking. So like so my point is, the only time that he films a close up of a sex scene is when actually the people having sex are not connected to each other. There's like an external thinking about someone else.
There is always a border.
There is a border there.
Angelopoulos.
And otherwise, the sex scenes are always shot in wide, and the bodies are kind of outlined, all like full body with lots of like headroom and lots of space. And this is like so much more like, you feel so much more like you're, paradoxically, you feel closer to it because you feel like you're watching it, the intimacy, rather than like a close-up shot, which is like attempting to kind of be the closeness.
Yeah.
That's my thought about intimacy. And
I think
I
it's a
learned
really
as a
good
filmmaker, I learned a huge amount just watching him do sex scenes, which are like certainly not the easiest scenes.
It makes me feel more ambitious as a filmmaker.
Definitely.
Like he's one of those filmmakers where he's not content with the smallness. Like he has to onion out. And it's a really amazing reflection. I think it's in Ulysses Gaze where one of the filmmakers he meets in Sarajevo says, "I feel like my life is a series of ever widening concentric circles."
Wow.
That's what the character says. I think it's a very good encapsulation of how Angelopoulos' film works. Like these reverberations, like kind of ripples on a pond. But I think is a good reminder to be as adventurous as you can be. Talking of which, I need to get my overground.
Final question: if a newcomer to the cinema of Angelopoulos is wondering where to start, which film should they watch first?
I do what I did, which is Landscapes in the Mist.
I would
Landscape
do
in
that
the Mist, get hooked, and then watch Eternity in the Day, then watch Traveling Players just to get a little bit of Greek history.
Or like watch a bit of it. And also
not 4
Beekeeper
hours.
is a banger.
Right, Kalanixa.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for listening, listeners.
Bye.
Take care.